So, moving on to our first speaker. From your programs, you can see it's Kelley Ross, who is going to speak about Sir Richard Burton and the sword. And a little bird told me that Kelley was no mean swordsman himself in his younger days. So, Kelley.
Oh, hi. Let's see, well, who am I? I taught philosophy for 22 years before retiring 10 years ago. Well, I suppose I've been teaching philosophy since I began as a graduate student in 1972, which was a while ago, I think. And also, a little bit, I may have been in Richard Burton's footsteps since I was a student in Beirut in 1969, 1970, and traveled around places like Syria, which now have been blown to bits. I don't think I'll be able to go back there. Anyway, I'm going to be talking about a little bit from Richard Burton's book of the Sword. And one thing in this book caught my attention, and one diagram and one short passage. The diagram I could have shown you on my website, but we don't have an internet connection here, so I reproduced it with stick figures. But it's in the book, or it's at the web page at my website up here. And what Burton has to say about this is, I've given precedence to the curved blade because cutting is more familiar to man than thrusting. Human nature strikes rounders until severe training teaches it to hit straight from the shoulder. And of course, in fencing, this involves a lot of training to overcome a lot of habits that are bad habits for fencing, because you want to address your opponent with the smallest profile of your body to present the smallest target. And the nice thing about piercing weapons is the business end is way out there and far away from you, which was always nice. In combat, you don't want your opponent near you, and this is what Burton points out. Yet there is no question of the superiority between the thrust and the cut. As the diagram shows, this figure who delivers a point has an advantage in time and distance over B, who uses the edge. So the business end is way out there, while if your opponent has a blade, he's raising it up above his head, and he's wide open to attack, and has nothing to interpose against an attack. He's wide open. So if you can lunge at him, you've got him. You've got him, while meanwhile he's getting ready to strike a blow at you. Indeed, the man who first gave point made a discovery which more than doubled the capacity of his weapon. Vegetius, this is the Roman military writer Vegetius Renatus, De Re Militari, from the end of the 4th century, who describes Roman equipment and tactics, and might have been the first book of military science, really, and a lot of it is very good. Some of it looks like maybe he wasn't always that familiar with combat, but he does know the basics of Roman military workings. Vegetius tells us that the Roman victories were owing to the use of the point rather than the cut. When cutting, the right arm and flank are exposed, whereas during the thrust, the body is guarded, and the adversary is wounded before he perceives it. And of course, what the Romans were using was the gladius, a short sword, and of course, they're fighting behind a shield wall So you're holding a shield, which is rather large, actually, and next to you is your companion who's also holding a shield. So you're behind a wall and there's an opening just between the shields. So when the Germans come up against you, you have your short gladius and you just go after them between the shields. And of course there's no room for a strike like that because you're liable to hit one of the shields and that's not going to do any good. But there's also something else about that. There's no room for a lunge either. You're going to be jabbing between the shields. And that's something my fencing teacher always got furious about. None of this damn jabbing. You're supposed to be lunging to take the maximum distance. But a Roman soldier didn't have that opportunity. There was no distance. You're right behind the shields and you're striking at an enemy who comes up against the shields. So most of this, I think, is very perceptive and very true. And I like it that Burton evidently studied fencing right here in Boulogne-sur-Mer. So he was doing this stuff around here. But there's something that Burton overlooks. I don't think Vegetius overlooks it because he's talking about Roman practice. But Burton, I think, overlooks something, and that is all of this works fine in fencing and in dueling, where you've got one opponent you have a narrow focus at them, and in sport fencing, you're on a sort of runway, and if you step off of that runway, you start over again. So you have a very narrow focus and you're looking at your opponent straight ahead. And all of this is perfectly true for that. And of course, fencing weapons, one thing that's revealing is that fencing weapons don't get used on the battlefield. And why is that? Because they're long and narrow, and if you're looking at an opponent out there, if the battle's a melee, there are people coming at you from the sides. And that's one thing I think Burton overlooks, although I'm sure if he was in a battle, he'd be aware of it very quickly. So in a duel, this person is exposed, raising up to strike a blow, but in a battle, in a melee, this is the guy who's exposed. Because any attack from the side, he is entirely unprepared for that. So the weapons that get used in battles in the 18th and 19th centuries have blades. And Burton concedes this himself, because cavalrymen don't carry épées, which only have a point. They carry sabers. And you can study saber in fencing. And if you're boarding a ship in the 18th, early 19th centuries, you have a cutlass that has a blade, because boarding a ship is always a melee. Always a melee. And with the Romans, the gladius had an edge also, for a very good reason. Because all of the kind of fighting that Burton and Vegetius describe is where the men are in formation. If you're behind the shield wall, then you're thrusting at the enemy. But everyone knew if you could break up a Roman legionary formation, they were in trouble. Because then if the battle breaks up into a melee, people are coming at you from every direction, and you need that blade. Just thrusting with the point is no longer going to be that much help unless you get an individual opponent, and that's what you can do to them. But people coming out from the side, you need to be ready to knock away blows that are coming at you from any direction. And in Japanese fencing, kendo, where you're using a bladed weapon all the time, that's usually taken into account. So in fencing, Western fencing, the on guard position, you're ready to go ahead. But there are a lot of on guard positions in kendo, and a lot of them you're just holding the sword ready near your body. Because in Japanese fencing, they're very aware you can be attacked at any time from any direction. In fact, in the Japanese fencing manuals, you have to be ready to fend off an attack even if you're going to the bathroom. Because in the age of duels in Japanese history, that's the way they would work. If you can get an opponent when they're at any disadvantage, you do it. So if you're just sitting in the latrine with your sword, you have to be ready. You have to be ready. And the ideal Japanese sword fight is to draw the sword, strike and kill with one blow, which I think is why the Japanese like baseball. Nothing happens in baseball until the guy hits the ball, and then everyone starts running around, and that's like a Japanese sword fight. A lot like it. So I was originally struck, oh, you've got my page up here. Yeah, well, there's the diagram. You said earlier you didn't have an internet connection.
Giovanni.
Evidently you do, great. So there's the actual diagram, but you see I got it pretty much correct. So what originally got my attention about Burton's reflections is how apt they were for fencing or dueling. And it was later I realized, well, what happens if you're in a melee? What happens if the Roman formation gets broken up, like by Hannibal or something? Roman soldiers then had more of a problem. And that's why in battles, I don't think you find epées, because that's not a very good weapon to have in a battle. But it's a beautiful weapon in a duel. So if you're D'Artagnan and running around with the Three Musketeers, that's gentlemen dueling. And if you go into the battle, you're going to want a different weapon. Anyway, so that's pretty much my presentation. I think I got in under the time limit. But anybody have any questions or discussion about this stuff?
Were there manuals in the British Army at the time, particularly relating to the use of cavalry swords? Was Burton writing in any sense a refutation of official practice?
Well, I wonder, because...
For example, or extending official practice? Or was it something that he did entirely of his own interest and related to the sport of fencing rather than the practice of fighting?
Well, no, I think he was writing about fighting also, because in the Book of the Sword, he does qualify all this, that for cavalrymen, using a weapon like an épée is very awkward, because you only have, if you're riding past someone with a pointed weapon, you pretty much got one chance to get at them. But with a saber and you're slashing, there's a much broader field where you can inflict an injury by doing that. So I think he was aware that the conditions of a duel or fencing are going to be different from combat. I just don't think he qualified it as much as he might have. And I don't know what kind of battles he was in, but like I said, about like I've been saying, in a melee, the conditions are very different than in a duel, and the weapons are very different. Now, if you look at the weapons that people used, they weren't foils or épées that you would use for dueling or fencing. And I think I remember the handout you had last night said something that Burton had written a manual about?
The book of the sword, and also a book about bayonets, which, you know.
Oh yeah, the bayonet book. And bayonets have an edge also. And of course, the bayonet was a replacement for the pike. And that was addressed to another very different circumstance of combat. Because in the early 17th century, the firearms were not very reliable, it was very slow to load them, and they were very inaccurate. So what a firearm could accomplish in the early days was limited, and armies relied for defense largely on the pike. And of course, the Swiss and the Flemish had discovered that if you had enough pikes, that could stop a cavalry charge, even of armored knights. And if you could do that, then that was the end of medieval warfare, in a way. And once the rifles became more reliable and more accurate, the pike was abandoned, but then it was replaced by the bayonet. So what the pikes might have done in the 17th century, bayonets were doing by the 19th century. But then gradually the usefulness of the bayonet declined, as the early bayonets were like this long. So you put that on the end of your rifle, and originally they went into the bore of the rifle, so you weren't even going to be using the rifle if you were using the bayonet. But eventually, bayonets were mounted around the barrel, and they got shorter and shorter and shorter until World War II. They were just knives. You could stick a knife on the front of your rifle, and I don't know how often that was used. But if you're out of ammunition and it's close combat, it's a melee, that could be useful. That could be useful. So God knows how often it was used. But that goes back to when bayonets were essential, and that's back to when pikes were essential, which is something I always like noting, because often people talk about the end of ancient warfare and the beginning of the Middle Ages. They act like cavalry was always going to be superior to infantry, and there was something obsolete about the Roman legion. But then that really wasn't the problem. The problem was money and how to raise a standing army. And once you could have the citizens called to arms, like the Flemish or the Swiss, the pike gave them the advantage over the mounted knights. In fact, that was a wonder of the age, I think, when the Swiss not only kept defeating the Habsburgs, but killed one of the Dukes of Austria in battle. That just astonished everyone. And it gave the Swiss a reputation for a century as the principal warriors of Europe. Everyone wanted to hire these Swiss mercenaries, and the popes still do. Although I think after 1500, the Swiss lost a battle and said, hell with this stuff. And so mostly they're just going to be in Switzerland. But it was even, I forgot the relative chronology, but the Flemish were defeating the French with pikes about the same time, or maybe a little bit earlier than the Swiss began doing that. And of course, sometimes that radically changed history. As when at the Battle of Nancy, when the Swiss killed the Duke of Lorraine, or well, actually the Duke of Burgundy. He wasn't the Duke of Lorraine yet, that was somebody else. But the Duke of Burgundy, Charles the Bold, that changed European history, because he didn't have a male heir, and his daughter had married Maximilian of Habsburg. So suddenly, most of the possessions of the Dukes of Burgundy wound up in the hands of the Habsburgs. And boy, that made a difference. That made a difference. And a few years ago, well, back, it's been a while, I think back in the 70s, there was a movie version of the story of Cyrano de Bergerac with Belmondo, and they did a very good job of representing the battles, because they had the pikes, they had the slow-firing muskets, and you could really see the way the battles worked. Of course, I think for a lot of movies like that now, they hire reenactors who spend all their weekends, you know, in the costumes and you know, doing the tactics of battle in those eras. So, okay, I think we're wrapped up. Enough time while I enjoy talking about it. Thank you.